The evening air was cool against Emma Grayson's skin as she ran through the quiet suburban streets of Oak Ridge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple, painting the cul-de-sac in a warm glow. It was supposed to be a simple run, 20 minutes to clear her head, just like she told her dad in the note she left on the kitchen counter. She had no reason to think anything of it. She had done this plenty of times before. But tonight was different. She had just rounded the corner when she noticed a golf cart parked by the entrance to the neighborhood park. 2 men in Navy security uniforms were watching her. At first, she ignored them, focusing on her breathing, the rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement. Then, one of them lifted a radio to his mouth. Seconds later, the vehicle's lights flashed. "Miss, stop right there," a voice called out. Emma hesitated, then slowed, her pulse already racing, not from exertion but from something colder, sharper. She turned to see the security guards approaching. One was tall and thin, the other stockier, his belt weighed down with a flashlight, radio, and something else, a zip tie? "You're violating the Oak Ridge curfew," the tall one said, stepping in front of her. "No outdoor activity past 8 p.m. You need to come with us." Emma frowned. "Curfew?" she repeated. "Since when?" "It's in the bylaws," the stocky guard said. "You're not supposed to be out right now. We'll need to take you back to the office until we sort this out." She took a step back, heart pounding. "I live here. I was just jogging. I'm going home now." The guards exchanged glances before the taller one sighed. "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. If you refuse to comply, we'll have to detain you." Emma's breath hitched. "Detain me? Are you serious?" Before she could react, the stocky guard grabbed her arm. Instinctively, she jerked away, but he was stronger, twisting her wrist just enough to make her gasp. A second later, the zip tie was wrapped around her hands, cinched tight. "Hey!" she cried out. "You can't do this." "Sorry, kid," the tall one muttered. "HOA rules." Inside the HOA office, Emma sat stiffly on a plastic chair, her hands still bound. The small, windowless room smelled like stale coffee and paperwork. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Across from her, Helen Morton sat at a desk, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the clipboard she held. Helen Morton had ruled Oak Ridge for the past decade with an iron will disguised as civic responsibility. She dressed in muted tones, beige blazers, modest skirts, but the way she carried herself, the way her cold, calculating eyes assessed everything around her, made it clear that she wielded power like a weapon. To her, the HOA was not just a homeowners association, it was her kingdom. She studied Emma with a look of disapproval, as if she were nothing more than a disorderly teenager who needed to be put in her place. "You were seen jogging past curfew," Helen finally said, her voice clipped and devoid of sympathy. "That is a direct violation of Section 12.4 of the Community Bylaws." Emma's throat was dry, but she managed to say, "I didn't know there was a curfew." "Then you should have read the rules," Helen said simply. "Ignorance is not an excuse." Emma clenched her fists. "This is insane. You can't just arrest people for going on a run." Helen sighed as if she were dealing with a particularly slow student. "We didn't arrest you, Emma. We detained you for violating community regulations." "There's a difference." Emma scoffed. "Yeah. Tell that to my wrists." Helen ignored her. "The police have been notified. They'll process you as a minor offender. If your father signs the necessary compliance documents, you'll be released to his custody." Emma's stomach twisted. The police. The HOA was treating this like a real crime. Her father was going to lose it. Miles away, inside a modest 2-story house, Richard Grayson was finishing up the last sip of his coffee when he heard the knock on his door. 3 sharp raps, not hesitant, not friendly. He straightened automatically. Years of military conditioning kicked in as he assessed the situation. Through the side window, he spotted 2 security guards standing rigidly on his porch. Behind them, a woman in a stiff blazer clutched a clipboard against her chest like it was a shield. Richard opened the door slowly, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Grayson?" Helen Morton asked, though it wasn't really a question. "That's me," he said. "Something wrong?" Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. Your daughter was caught violating the curfew. She has been detained. Richard's eyes darkened. Detained. She refused to comply with security's instructions, Helen continued, her tone unwavering. She was taken to our processing office. The police have been notified. For a moment, Richard didn't move. His pulse remained steady, but his jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had commanded soldiers in war zones. "You put my daughter in custody," he said slowly, deliberately. "For running." Helen met his stare without flinching. "For breaking the rules." Richard exhaled through his nose, his fingers curling into his palms. "I want her back. Now." "She will be released after police processing," Helen replied curtly. "Until then, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the bylaws. This is not the army, General Grayson. This is a community, and we value order." Richard stepped forward, towering over her. His shadow stretched across the porch. "You think you know order?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Lady, I've seen order upheld with blood and bullets. I've seen order break men. You don't know the first damn thing about it." Helen's expression flickered, just for a second, but she recovered quickly. "Then you should understand that rules are necessary. We'll be in touch." With that, she turned and walked away, the security guards trailing behind her. Richard stood motionless, fists clenched at his sides. And then, in the distance, red and blue lights flashed. Emma sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, her hands still raw from the zip ties. The air smelled like bleach and something metallic. She tried to fight back the sting in her eyes, but a single tear slipped down her cheek. She wasn't a criminal. She hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, here she was, treated like one. The door buzzed open. A police officer stepped in, clipboard in hand. "Emma Grayson," he said. "Your father's here." Relief flooded her. She scrambled to her feet as the officer led her down the hall. When she stepped into the lobby, she saw him, Richard Grayson, standing tall, arms crossed, eyes hard as steel. The moment she reached him, he opened his arms, and she fell into them, her breath hitching against his chest. "Let's go," he murmured. "This isn't over." That night, as Richard sat in his study, flipping through the HOA bylaws, a realization settled over him. This wasn't just about Emma. This was about something much bigger, something buried in legalese, hidden in plain sight. And he was going to bring it all crashing down. The ride home from the station was eerily silent. Emma sat curled in the passenger seat, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands, her fingers gripping the fabric like a lifeline. Richard drove, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His mind was a battlefield, tactical decisions forming, calculations running, a strategy assembling itself as surely as if he were planning an operation in enemy territory. "Dad, Emma finally started, but Richard reached out and gently touched her hand, shaking his head. "Not yet," he said softly. "Not tonight." She nodded, understanding. Not because she agreed, but because the weight of what had happened still hung thick in the air. She didn't have the words, and right now, neither did he. They pulled into the driveway of their quiet suburban home, the same house Richard had hoped would be a place of peace. The porch light flickered slightly, the only movement in an otherwise frozen night. He stepped out, walked around, and opened Emma's door for her. She stepped out on shaky legs, inhaled deeply, and let out a breath that seemed to carry more than just air. It carried disbelief, exhaustion, anger. "Get some sleep," Richard murmured. "Tomorrow we fight." Sleep never came easily to a soldier, especially not when his daughter had been unlawfully detained by a power-hungry HOA president. Richard sat at the dining table, flipping through the HOA bylaws, cross-referencing every rule, every clause, every legal loophole Helen Morton had used as a weapon. The more he read, the angrier he became. Curfews with no legal basis. Security forces deputized under ambiguous county regulations. Fines imposed without community votes. Policies written in a way that discouraged resistance, because who had time to fight when life was already so full of battles? Richard did. And he knew others would too. By morning, he had a plan. The first call he made was to Mara Zegler, a constitutional attorney who had made a career of dismantling small-scale authoritarianism. When she picked up, he skipped the pleasantries. "Mara, I need you to look into something for me. An HOA in Oak Ridge, Texas. They detained my daughter last night for jogging." A pause. Then a sharp inhale. "They what? Exactly?" He let that hang in the air before continuing. "I have their bylaws in front of me. I need to know how much of this is legal, and how much of it is just people assuming they have power." "Send me everything you have," she said immediately. "This sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen." He wasn't done. His next call was to Janelle Cruz, a local reporter known for exposing HOA corruption. When she heard what happened, she whistled low. "Grayson, I think you just handed me my next front-page story. Send me details." By the time Emma woke up, the storm was already brewing. At first, the whispers were small, concerned parents talking in hushed tones at the coffee shop, a few murmurs in neighborhood group chats. But it didn't take long for the outrage to spread. Richard watched it unfold in real time. Posts started appearing online. "Did you hear about the general's daughter? HOA overreach at its worst. We should have spoken up sooner." And then the stories came. A woman posted about how she had been fined for hanging wind chimes on her porch. A father wrote about how his son had been threatened with eviction for playing basketball in the driveway. An elderly man recounted how his wife had been bullied into removing her flower pots because they were deemed unsightly. It wasn't just Emma. It had never just been Emma. By the end of the day, a protest had been organized. Richard hadn't needed to lift a finger. The people were ready to fight. Richard stood on the sidelines as the crowd gathered outside the HOA office. Parents, teenagers, elderly residents, all of them armed not with weapons, but with signs and voices. HOA overreach must end. Let our kids be kids. Freedom means running too. News vans were parked along the curb, cameras rolling as Janelle Cruz conducted interviews. And then, right in the center of it all, was Helen Morton. She stood on the HOA office steps, arms crossed, flanked by security guards who looked more like mercenaries than neighborhood watch. She was calm, poised, but Richard saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. She was losing control. "These rules exist for the safety of our community," she declared to the gathered crowd, her voice ringing out over the noise. "We have the legal authority to enforce them." Richard stepped forward then, his presence enough to silence the murmurs. "And what about our legal authority to challenge them?" His voice was steady, carrying the weight of his years of leadership. "Your rules weren't voted on. Your security force operates in the shadows. You act like a government, but you're just a committee of homeowners drunk on power." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Helen's face turned a shade paler. Janelle turned to her camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, what started as a simple jog has turned into a battle for basic freedoms in this suburban community. The question remains, how far can an HOA go before it crosses the line?" Helen turned, muttering something to her security team before disappearing inside the building. She was running out of ground to stand on. That night, Richard sat at his desk, the house silent except for the hum of his laptop. Emails flooded in, from lawyers, civil rights activists, even veterans who had faced similar battles against unchecked authority. And then, the email he was waiting for, Mara Zegler's full legal analysis. Richard clicked it open and scanned the text. Multiple violations of constitutional rights, including due process and unlawful detainment. No formal county oversight of the HOA security force, questionable legality of their power. Curfew bylaw has no standing under state or federal law. At the bottom, Mara had typed 4 simple words. "You have them cornered." Richard exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced by the illusion of authority. The next morning, Richard filed an official lawsuit against the Oak Ridge HOA. It wasn't just about overturning Emma's detainment, it was about dismantling the entire corrupt system. And as he hit send on the email, he knew one thing for certain. Helen Morton and her self-appointed empire were about to fall. Helen Morton may have gone silent, but the HOA board wasn't ready to give up control. The resignation of 3 members had left gaps, and new members were quickly appointed, people just as dedicated to keeping the community under strict rule. Almost overnight, new flyers appeared on every doorstep, warning about the dangers of mob rule and reckless disregard for safety. The HOA's legal team issued statements claiming the curfew rule was misinterpreted and that Emma's detention had been a misunderstanding. They painted Richard Grayson not as a concerned father, but as a man using his military background to bully a peaceful community. Richard wasn't surprised. In his years of service, he'd seen misinformation used as a weapon before. He knew this was a desperate attempt to regain control, but he also knew something else. They were scared. The fact that they had to justify their actions meant they were losing ground. While Richard was strategizing his next move, Emma was facing her own battle. At school, she became an unwilling celebrity. Some students cheered her on, wearing homemade #LetHerRun shirts, while others, children of HOA supporters, whispered behind her back, calling her a troublemaker. One afternoon, she found herself face to face with Helen Morton's grandson, a boy named Jacob. He sneered as he passed her in the hallway. "Hope your dad's ready to lose," he muttered. "My grandma says you're just looking for attention." Emma could have ignored him, could have walked away. But she'd been quiet long enough. She turned to face him, her voice steady. "If standing up for myself means getting attention, then yeah, I guess I am. And maybe your grandma should stop treating kids like criminals." Jacob's smirk faltered, and he walked away without another word. Emma felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just the girl who got arrested anymore. She was someone who had a choice, to stay silent or to speak up. And she had made her decision. Richard's call to Mara Zegler hadn't gone unanswered. The high-powered constitutional lawyer arrived in town with a team of legal experts, ready to dissect the HOA's bylaws line by line. Their findings were damning. The HOA had overstepped its authority in multiple ways, enforcing rules that had never been legally approved, detaining minors without parental consent, and operating a security force with questionable legal backing. Mara wasted no time. She filed an official lawsuit against the HOA, citing civil rights violations, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power. News outlets swarmed the courthouse, eager to cover what was shaping up to be a landmark case. Richard stood beside Mara as she faced the press. "This isn't just about Emma," she told reporters. "This is about every family in this neighborhood who has been forced to live under unjust and unlawful rules. The HOA thought they could act as their own government. It's time they learned otherwise." With the lawsuit in motion, the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Parents who had been too afraid to speak out finally found the courage. They organized town hall meetings, shared stories, and demanded transparency. A group of veterans living in Oak Ridge formed a security watch to ensure the HOA's private security didn't harass residents anymore. They weren't armed, but their presence alone sent a message. Intimidation wouldn't work here anymore. At one meeting, a mother named Carla stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "My son has been too scared to ride his bike past dark because of these rules. This isn't a community, it's a dictatorship. We have to take our neighborhood back." The crowd erupted in applause. The fight had started as Richard's, but now it belonged to all of them. The day of the first court hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Helen Morton sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Richard, Emma, and Mara stood together. The judge listened as Mara laid out the case. The HOA violated the fundamental rights of a minor, she argued. They enforced a curfew without legal standing, detained a child without cause, and weaponized their authority to suppress basic freedoms. If this isn't an abuse of power, then what is? Helen's attorney countered, claiming the HOA had acted in the best interest of the community's safety. But as the judge reviewed the evidence, the vague bylaws, the security footage of Emma's detention, the testimonies from other residents, it became clear the HOA had overreached. As the proceedings continued, Richard leaned toward Emma and whispered, "No matter what happens today, we've already won." She looked up at him, her father, the man who had fought for her not with weapons but with unwavering resolve. And for the first time in days, she believed him. As the national attention on the case continued to swell, legal experts began dissecting the HOA's policies. Constitutional lawyers, civil rights activists, and former law enforcement officials weighed in on the legality of a neighborhood association detaining minors without clear oversight. News channels hosted debates, with some defending the HOA's right to enforce community rules and others condemning the actions as a violation of basic freedoms. Emma's case became a rallying cry, prompting deeper scrutiny of similar HOAs across the country. Under pressure, the Texas Attorney General announced an official investigation into Oak Ridge HOA's governance, signaling the beginning of a legal reckoning. Richard, having spent his career navigating military bureaucracy, knew how to build an airtight case. He collaborated with attorneys, providing them with evidence from the HOA's own documents. His daughter's ordeal had been the spark, but now the battle was much bigger. Multiple families came forward with testimonies of harassment, excessive fines, and questionable detainment practices. The HOA board, once untouchable, now found itself on the defensive. Helen Morton, previously so rigid in her enforcement of the rules, refused interviews and began avoiding public appearances. As public sentiment turned against the Oak Ridge HOA, Helen Morton struggled to maintain control. Former board members, perhaps sensing the sinking ship, began leaking internal emails that revealed how the HOA had manipulated rules to maintain power. Some messages even showed how security policies had been selectively enforced to target families who had previously voiced complaints. Faced with mounting evidence and public outrage, Helen Morton was pressured to step down. During a heated HOA meeting, broadcasted live on social media, homeowners confronted her directly. She attempted to justify her actions, citing safety concerns, but her reasoning fell apart under questioning. The moment that sealed her fate came when a neighbor, an elderly veteran, stood up and simply said, "You made a girl feel like a criminal for jogging. Is that what you call leadership?" The room fell silent, and within days, she resigned in disgrace. Her departure marked a turning point, but Richard knew the fight wasn't over. With Helen Morton gone, the Oak Ridge HOA was left in disarray. A temporary board was formed, and for the first time in years, the residents had a say in how their community was run. Richard, while not interested in a leadership role, played an instrumental part in guiding discussions on reform. He pushed for transparency, advocating for policies that prevented abuses of power. The curfew rule was immediately overturned, and the community's security team was disbanded, replaced by city law enforcement oversight. Beyond Oak Ridge, the case triggered statewide discussions about the power of HOAs. Lawmakers proposed new legislation requiring homeowner votes for major policy changes and limiting private security powers. What had started as one father's fight for justice had transformed into a broader movement challenging unchecked authority. With the legal battles winding down, Emma finally began to heal. The support from her peers and even strangers across the country reminded her that she wasn't alone. She started running again, not just to clear her head, but as a symbol of resilience. Her story inspired others, and soon, a new trend emerged on social media. #RunForEmma, where people posted videos of themselves jogging in defiance of oppressive rules everywhere. Richard watched his daughter reclaim her confidence. He knew that while wounds heal, memories remain. But instead of letting the experience define her as a victim, she chose to embrace it as proof of her strength. She had faced injustice, stood up to it, and helped change the system. Now, she was free in a way she never had been before. One evening, Richard sat on the front porch, watching the neighborhood with new eyes. It no longer looked like the pristine, rule-bound community it once was. It was livelier, more open. Kids played freely, people spoke openly, and the air of quiet repression had lifted. Emma jogged past, waving at her dad with a smile. He returned it, feeling something he hadn't in a long time: true peace. This wasn't the battlefield he had trained for, but it had been a battle nonetheless. A different kind of enemy, a different kind of war. But the same lesson applied: freedom was never guaranteed. It had to be defended, even in the most unexpected places. And now, he knew, his daughter would carry that lesson forward into her own future. Richard Grayson had spent his life fighting for his country. This time, he had fought for his home. And in doing so, he had won something greater than any medal: justice, not just for Emma, but for an entire community.